The clock on the office wall ticked past 9 p.m. as the state attorney general gathered his papers from the large mahogany desk. He let out a tired sigh, rubbing his eyes after hours of reviewing case files. The civil rights lawsuit he was preparing needed to be perfect. Too many people were counting on him to get this right. The office hallways were quiet now, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Most of his staff had left hours ago, but being the state's top lawyer meant long nights were more common than not. The cleaning crew gave him friendly waves as he passed. They were used to seeing him at this hour. As he walked to his car in the underground parking garage, his phone buzzed with a message from his wife. "Don't forget to pick up your heart medication from the pharmacy." He smiled at her thoughtfulness. After 23 years of marriage, she still looked out for him like they were newlyweds. The pharmacist had already closed for the night, but that was okay. His dark blue sit-in purred to life as he turned the key. Despite his high-ranking position, he preferred driving himself rather than having a chauffeur. These quiet nighttime drives gave him time to think, to process the weight of the cases that crossed his desk each day. Tonight's drive felt especially peaceful. The streets were mostly empty, with just the occasional car passing by. The autumn air was crisp, and leaves danced across the road in his headlights. Street lamps cast a warm glow over the suburban neighborhoods he passed through, their light reflecting off his car's perfectly legal window tint. His mind wandered to tomorrow's meetings. There was the budget review at 9 a.m., followed by a press conference about the new consumer protection guidelines. But the civil rights case was what really occupied his thoughts. The evidence they'd gathered showed a clear pattern of discrimination in housing applications. If they won, it could help thousands of families get fair treatment. He adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, still neat and straight despite the long day. His mother had taught him early on to always look presentable, saying people would judge him more harshly than others. "You have to be twice as good," she'd say, straightening his collar before school. Now, decades later in serving as state attorney general, he still lived by those words. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle jazz tune that reminded him of the music his father used to play in their home. His dad had worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, and now here he was, the state's top prosecutor. He wished his father had lived long enough to see him sworn in. Passing through a quiet intersection, he noticed how different the city felt at night. During the day, these streets bustled with life. Kids walking to school, people rushing to work, vendors selling hot dogs on corners. Now it was just him, his thoughts, and the occasional glow of windows from homes where families were settling in for the night. His own neighborhood was just a few turns away. He was looking forward to getting home, maybe catching the end of the basketball game while he reviewed some more case files. His wife would probably have left some dinner in the microwave for him. She always did on late nights. The dashboard clock showed 9:47 p.m. as he turned onto Cedar Avenue. The street was lined with old oak trees, their branches creating patterns of shadow and moonlight on the road. He'd driven this route hundreds of times, knew every curve and stop sign by heart. Everything felt normal, routine, just another quiet night heading home after a long day serving the public. Then he saw the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank a little, not from fear, but from a weary familiarity. Even in his pressed suit, even in his position of authority, even with the state's highest law enforcement credentials in his wallet, he was about to be reminded that some things hadn't changed as much as people liked to believe. Taking a deep breath, he began to pull over, already running through the mental checklist he'd followed countless times before. Turn on interior lights, hands on steering wheel, movements slow and deliberate. Just like he'd advised so many others to do. The police cruiser's lights painted everything in flashing red and blue. The state attorney general guided his sit-in carefully to the curb, making sure to signal properly. Through his rearview mirror, he could see the officer sitting in the patrol car for an unusually long time before getting out. This wasn't his first experience with a traffic stop. Far from it. and he already knew the signs of what might be coming. His hand stayed firmly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock, just like his father had taught him years ago. The memory of that conversation flooded back, sitting in their driveway, his dad's voice serious but gentle. It doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't matter if you're innocent. What matters is getting home safe. The officer finally emerged from his vehicle, and even in the darkness, the Attorney General could see how the policeman's hand rested near his holster. It was a small detail that spoke volumes. Through his side mirror, he watched the beam of the officer's flashlight sweep across his license plate, then along the car's body, lingering on the window tint that he knew perfectly well was within legal limits. The tap on his window was sharp, aggressive. He pressed the button to lower it smoothly, keeping his other hand visible on the wheel. The flashlight beam hit his face directly, making him squint. He could barely make out the officer's features behind the glaring light. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not bothering with the usual "good evening" that the Attorney General had heard him use with other drivers just last week during a community oversight meeting. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been reviewing that very officer's body cam footage as part of a departmental assessment. "Officer," he replied, keeping his voice steady and professional, "before I reach for anything, I'd like to know why I was pulled over." It was a reasonable question, one that any citizen had the right to ask. He'd argued this point countless times in legal briefings and department trainings. The flashlight beam didn't waver. "I said license and registration." The officer's tone grew harder. "Are you refusing to comply with the lawful order?" A car passed by slowly, its driver rubbernecking at the scene. The Attorney General thought about his wife waiting at home, probably wondering what was taking him so long. He thought about his teenage son, who would be getting his driver's license next month. These thoughts kept him calm, focused. "Not at all, officer. I'm simply asking for the reason for the stop, as is my right under state law." He paused, then added, "The same law I helped draft 3 years ago." The flashlight beam finally lowered slightly. "You had some suspicious driving patterns back there, and your windows looked too dark." It was always the same excuses. The Attorney General had heard them hundreds of times in complaints filed with his office. Suspicious driving patterns, tinted windows, failed to signal, broken tail light. He'd spent years documenting these pretexts, building cases, pushing for reform. "I'm going to reach for my credentials now," he announced clearly, moving his right hand slowly toward his jacket pocket. The officer's posture tensed visibly. "They're in my breast pocket." The weight of the moment pressed down on him. Here he was, the state's highest-ranking law enforcement official, having to navigate this situation with the same careful precision as any other person of color. His years of legal experience, his position, his achievements, none of that was visible through the window of his car on this dark street. His fingers touched the leather wallet in his pocket. Inside were 2 forms of identification: his driver's license and his state attorney general badge. In a few seconds, this encounter would take a dramatic turn. But right now, in this moment, he was just another driver being treated with unwarranted suspicion. He thought about all the people who'd come to his office with similar stories, all the cases his team had investigated, all the reforms they'd pushed for. Sometimes change needed more than just laws and policies. Sometimes it needed moments like this. Moments that turned assumptions upside down and forced people to confront their own biases. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his wallet, aware that what happened next would likely become another teaching moment in the long struggle for equal treatment under the law. The leather wallet felt heavy in his hands as the state attorney general carefully opened it, making sure the officer could see every movement. Years of experience in law enforcement had taught him that these next few moments were crucial. The streetlight above cast strange shadows across the scene, making everything feel more tense than it already was. "Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer commanded, his flashlight beam still trained on the car's interior. The Attorney General noticed how the officer's hand hadn't moved from his holster since approaching the vehicle. It was the kind of detail he'd highlighted dozens of times in police training seminars. "My hands are visible, officer," he replied calmly, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. This was a dance he knew all too well, one he documented countless times in civil rights cases, one he fought against in courtrooms and legislative sessions. Yet here he was, living it again. The officer's stance was rigid, unnecessarily defensive for a simple traffic stop. Through the mirror, the Attorney General could see a second patrol car pulling up quietly behind the first one. No lights, just a silent arrival that spoke volumes about assumptions being made. He'd seen this pattern before in countless case files that had crossed his desk. As he held up his driver's license, he kept his movements deliberate and slow. "Officer, I'm going to show you my credentials now. Both of them." The emphasis on both was subtle but clear. Years of prosecuting cases had taught him the importance of clear communication in tense situations. The flashlight beam shifted to illuminate the licenses in his hand. First, his regular driver's license, clean record, no violations. Then, sliding out from behind it, the gold badge and credentials of the State Attorney General's office gleamed in the harsh light. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the usual crackle of the police radio seemed to pause. The Attorney General watched as the officer's eyes moved between the credentials and his face, then back again. The recognition dawned slowly, like a sunrise nobody wanted to see. "Sir, I—" The officer started, his voice suddenly losing its authoritative edge. The hand near his holster dropped to his side. The flashlight beam wavered, then lowered. "I didn't realize—" Clearly, the Attorney General replied, keeping his tone professional but firm. "Now, those suspicious driving patterns you mentioned." He glanced at his watch, noting the time. "Everything about this stop would need to be documented, not for revenge, but for the bigger picture." The second officer had stepped out of their car now, curious about the sudden change in atmosphere. The Attorney General could hear them whispering into their radio, probably alerting dispatch about who they'd just pulled over. He'd seen this scene play out before, but usually from the other side of a desk while reviewing complaints. "Sir, there may have been a misunderstanding." The first officer attempted to backtrack, his earlier aggression replaced with obvious discomfort. The flashlight was off now, tucked awkwardly into his belt. "A misunderstanding," the Attorney General repeated thoughtfully. "Let's talk about that. First, I'd like your badge number and name. Then we can discuss why you felt it necessary to call for backup during a routine traffic stop where no crime was being committed." He could see both officers shifting uncomfortably now. Their body cameras were recording everything. Another policy he helped implement. Tonight would become more than just another traffic stop. It would become evidence, a teaching moment, perhaps even a catalyst for change. Through his windshield, he noticed more cars slowing down as they passed, drivers trying to figure out why two police cars had stopped such an ordinary-looking sedan. He thought about all the other traffic stops happening tonight across the state. How many of them were based on the same kind of misunderstanding? "While you're noting down your badge number," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of his office, "I'd also like to request the dash cam footage from both vehicles. We'll need to review the suspicious driving patterns you observed." Each word was measured, professional, laying the groundwork for what would come next. The night had turned into something much bigger than a simple drive home. But then again, that's how change often happened. One traffic stop, one interaction, one moment of truth at a time. The silence that followed felt electric. The State Attorney General watched as his credentials passed from the first officer's shaking hands to the second officer's eager inspection. Their flashlights now pointed at the ground, a stark contrast to their earlier aggressive positioning. "I'm chief of our state's law enforcement," he said quietly, his voice carrying the natural authority earned through years of public service. "The same department that oversees police conduct across every county in our state." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, including this one. The first officer's face had lost all its previous confidence. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool night air. Just 15 minutes ago, he had approached this car ready for confrontation. Now he looked like a student caught cheating on an exam. "Sir, if I had known who you were—" The officer began, but the Attorney General raised his hand slightly, cutting him off. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" he said, maintaining his professional tone. "The way you handle a traffic stop shouldn't depend on who's behind the wheel. Whether I'm the Attorney General or a high school teacher, the treatment should be the same." Red and blue lights still painted the street in rotating colors, drawing more attention from passing cars. Some had slowed down to watch the scene unfold. The Attorney General thought about how many of them had experienced similar stops, similar prejudgments. The second officer was now frantically radioing someone, speaking in hushed tones. Probably calling a supervisor, standard procedure when something goes wrong. Through his open window, the Attorney General could catch fragments of the conversation. State Attorney General. Yes, the actual. No, I'm not joking. He used this moment to pull out his phone and make a few quick notes. Times, badge numbers, patrol car numbers, all details he'd need later. Not for punishment, but for something more important, systemic change. "Officers," he said, drawing their attention back, "I'd like to know what made you run my plates in the first place." His tone was conversational but firm, like he was speaking to witnesses in a courtroom. "Before you answer, remember that everything is being recorded on your body cameras." The first officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Standard procedure, sir," he mumbled, but his eyes couldn't meet the Attorney General's steady gaze. "Is it standard procedure to call for backup before approaching a vehicle with no criminal history, no outstanding warrants, and no traffic violations?" The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. A new set of headlights approached, the supervisor's car arriving right on cue. The Attorney General checked his watch again. His wife would be worried by now, but some moments were worth being late for. As the supervisor hurried toward them, the Attorney General thought about his son again. About the conversation they'd have tomorrow. About how this incident would become part of the ongoing lesson about navigating the world, not just as a young man, but as a young man of color. The supervisor was already apologizing before reaching the car, his words tumbling out in a rush of "sir" and "sorry" and "unfortunate misunderstanding." But the Attorney General's focus remained on the first officer, who still stood there, badge glinting in the streetlight. "Tomorrow," the Attorney General said clearly, "I'm going to request all footage from this stop. I'll review it personally. Not because I'm angry, but because this needs to be a teaching moment." He paused, making sure each word landed. "We can do better than this. We must do better than this." He watched realization dawn on their faces. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. This was about to become a case study in every police department across the state. A reminder that change doesn't always come from policy papers and legal reforms. Sometimes it comes from real-world moments like this, when assumptions and reality collide in the beam of a flashlight on a quiet suburban street. The supervisor's radio crackled with worried voices as word spread through the department. 3 police cars now lined the quiet suburban street, their presence drawing more attention than anyone wanted. The state attorney general remained in his car, calmly typing notes on his phone while the officers huddled in a tense discussion several feet away. "Sir," the supervisor approached his window again, his voice carefully measured. "We can't apologize enough for this unfortunate incident. If there's anything we can do—" He trailed off, probably realizing there was nothing he could say to make this situation better. The Attorney General looked up from his phone. "Actually, there is something you can do." He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone used to being heard in courtrooms. "I want a complete review of every traffic stop made by these officers in the past 6 months. Every single one." The supervisor's face paled slightly. They both knew what such a review might reveal. Statistics and patterns that had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right authority to notice them. "Of course, sir," the supervisor nodded, jotting notes in his small notepad. The Attorney General noticed his hand was shaking slightly. "Would you like us to send that directly to your office, or—" "I'll be there personally tomorrow morning," he interrupted gently. 8 a.m. sharp. "We'll need all body camera footage, dash cam videos, and written reports." He paused, then added, "And I'd like both officers present for the review." The first officer, who had been standing back near his patrol car, visibly stiffened. The second officer stared at his boots. They had probably expected a quick reprimand, maybe a formal complaint. Instead, they were about to become part of something much bigger. A text message lit up the Attorney General's phone, his wife asking if everything was okay. He quickly replied, assuring her he was safe and would explain everything soon. This wasn't the kind of story you shared through text messages. "One more thing," he said, looking directly at the first officer. "I want you to tell me honestly. What made you suspicious of my driving tonight?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but curious, almost educational. The officer stepped forward, struggling to find words. "Sir, it was just a feeling. Something seemed off about the car, the way it was moving so carefully through the neighborhood." "So carefully," the Attorney General repeated thoughtfully. "You mean following all traffic laws, staying exactly at the speed limit? The kind of driving someone might do if they knew they couldn't afford to make even the smallest mistake." Understanding slowly dawned on the officer's face. The kind of understanding that comes from seeing your own actions through someone else's eyes for the first time. The Attorney General continued, his voice still calm but firm. "Tomorrow, we're going to look at those traffic stop records together. We're going to analyze the patterns. And then we're going to have a very honest conversation about why those patterns exist." He started his car engine, signaling that the interaction was ending. The officers stepped back, their postures a mixture of relief and apprehension. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own revelations. "This isn't about punishment," he assured them, rolling up his window. "It's about growth. About making sure that the next person you stop, whoever they might be, gets treated with the same respect you'd want for your own family members." As he pulled away from the curb, he watched in his rearview mirror as the 3 police cars remained parked, their lights now off. The officers stood in a tight circle, probably already discussing what tomorrow would bring. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his wife. "Bringing your favorite dessert home," she wrote. "Looks like you could use it tonight." He smiled slightly. Even in moments like these, life's small comforts mattered. The rest of the drive home was quiet, but his mind was already working, planning tomorrow's meeting, thinking about how to turn this moment into meaningful change. Sometimes, the best lessons came from the most unexpected places, even a routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. News travels fast in police departments. By the time the sun rose the next morning, every officer in the precinct knew about last night's traffic stop. The station buzzed with nervous energy as the state attorney general walked through the front doors at exactly 8 a.m., his briefcase in one hand and a stack of files in the other. The desk sergeant nearly dropped his coffee cup when he saw him. "Good morning, sir," he stammered, quickly standing up. "They're waiting for you in the conference room." The attorney general nodded politely as he passed. Through the glass walls, he could see the 2 officers from last night, along with their supervisor and the police chief. They'd been there since 7 a.m., reviewing their body camera footage, probably rehearsing explanations. "Let's start with the numbers," he said as he entered the room, not wasting time on small talk. He pulled out several graphs and charts from his briefcase. "My office ran some quick statistics last night. In the past 6 months, your department has made 2,847 traffic stops. Care to guess how those break down?" The room was silent. The police chief, a veteran of 20 years, looked uncomfortable. The first officer from last night kept his eyes fixed on the table. What we found, the Attorney General continued, spreading the papers across the table, is a pattern. And patterns tell stories. He pointed to one particular chart. Would anyone like to explain why certain neighborhoods see 3 times as many stops as others, despite having lower traffic volumes? The supervisor shifted in his seat. Sir, those areas have higher crime rates. Do they? The Attorney General pulled out another document. Because according to official crime statistics, they don't. What they do have is a different demographic makeup. He wasn't here to shame anyone. That wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he pulled out more papers, training materials, policy documents, and reform proposals that his office had been developing for months. Last night's incident had just given them the perfect case study. Here's what we're going to do, he said, his tone shifting from questioning to constructive. First, we're implementing immediate changes to traffic stop protocols. Every stop will require clear, articulable reasons, not feelings or suspicions. The police chief leaned forward, looking relieved that there was a path forward. We can start training officers on the new protocols immediately. Good. The Attorney General nodded. But that's just the beginning. I want body camera reviews every week, not just when incidents occur. I want community feedback sessions. And most importantly, he looked directly at the officer who had stopped him. I want officers to understand why these changes matter. The young officer finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Sir, about last night. I've been thinking about what you said. About treating everyone the same way we'd want our families treated. That's exactly where we start, the Attorney General replied. Because every person you stop is someone's family member. Every car you pull over contains someone's whole world. He pulled out one final document, a personal account of last night's stop that he'd written early this morning. This isn't going in any official file, he explained. But I want every officer in this department to read it, to understand what it feels like on the other side of those flashing lights. The morning stretched into afternoon as they worked through the details of the new policies. Other officers drifted in and out of the conference room, curious about what was happening. Each time, the Attorney General invited them to join to be part of the solution. By day's end, what had started as a potential scandal had transformed into something unexpected, a genuine opportunity for change. The department would become a model for others, proving that accountability and improvement were possible. As he packed up his briefcase to leave, the Attorney General paused. Remember, he said to the room of officers, last night could have gone very differently. Instead, let's make it the moment everything started to change for the better. The local news caught wind of the story 3 days later. At first, it was just a small article in the morning paper. State Attorney General stopped by local police. But it quickly grew bigger than anyone expected. By noon, national news networks were calling the Attorney General's office, hungry for details. We should get ahead of this, his communications director urged during their morning meeting. The story's going viral on social media. People are already taking sides without knowing the facts. The Attorney General sat at his desk, reading through the flood of emails and messages that had poured in since the story broke. Some were from other officials who'd had similar experiences. Many were from ordinary citizens sharing their own stories of traffic stops gone wrong. Set up a press conference, he decided. But not here at the office. Let's do it at the police department. His team looked surprised, but he continued, this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about showing how we can work together to fix things. The press conference room was packed an hour later. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters filled every seat, and more people stood along the sides. The police chief stood nervously beside the podium, adjusting his collar in the harsh lights. The Attorney General stepped up to the microphone, his prepared statement tucked in his pocket. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he decided to speak from the heart instead. 3 nights ago, I was pulled over while driving home, He began simply. Many people want to know if I'm angry, if I'm planning to file lawsuits or demand resignations. He paused, letting the reporters lean forward in anticipation. But I'm not here to fuel anger or division. I'm here because what happened to me happens to countless others every day. The only difference is, I'm in a position to do something about it. He gestured to the police chief to join him at the podium. Together, they unveiled the new training programs and accountability measures they developed over the past few days. The reporters' pens scratched frantically across notepads. This isn't just about one traffic stop or one department, the Attorney General continued. It's about recognizing patterns and having the courage to change them. It's about making sure that everyone who swears to protect and serve understands who they're protecting and serving. All of us, equally. Questions flew from the crowd. Would officers be fired? Was there going to be a lawsuit? Who would pay for all these new programs? The officers involved aren't being fired, he answered firmly. They're becoming part of the solution. Sometimes the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons. The officer who had stopped him was there too, standing quietly at the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly, and the Attorney General saw something he hadn't seen that night: understanding. As the press conference ended, his phone buzzed with a message from his son. "Proud of you, Dad." He smiled, thinking about how different things might be by the time his son started driving. Back in his office later that day, he watched as the story spread across news channels. Some praised his measured response, others criticized him for not taking stronger action. But he knew he'd made the right choice. His assistant brought in more letters and emails from people across the state. Many shared similar stories, but now they added something new: hope that things might finally change. "Your office is getting calls from other states," his deputy mentioned, poking her head in. "They want to know more about our new training programs. Looks like we might have started something bigger than we planned." The Attorney General nodded, reaching for another stack of messages to read. Sometimes the best way to fight old problems was with new solutions. Sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger, but education. And sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best chances for real change. 2 months after the traffic stop, the police department's training room was packed with officers from across the state. At the front of the room, the officer who had stopped the Attorney General that night was speaking, sharing his experience with a room full of his colleagues. "I thought I was just doing my job," he explained, his voice steady but humble. "But that night changed how I see everything. It's not just about following procedures. It's about understanding why those procedures exist, and more importantly, why they sometimes fail us." The Attorney General sat quietly in the back of the room watching. He hadn't planned to attend today's training session, but something drew him here. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the desire to see if real change was possible. On the screen behind the officer, body camera footage played silently. That night's traffic stop from the officer's perspective. The room was completely silent as they watched the familiar scene unfold. But this time, it wasn't just about one stop. It was about learning, about doing better. "Look at my approach here," the officer pointed out. "See how my hand is already on my weapon. What message does that send before I've even spoken to the driver?" He paused the video. "Now let's talk about why I made that choice and what I could have done differently." Other officers in the room nodded, took notes, asked questions. This wasn't the usual mandatory training that everyone slept through. This was real, raw, and relevant to their daily work. The police chief stepped forward next, sharing data from their first month under the new protocols. Traffic stops were down by 30%, but their success rate in finding actual violations had increased. Community complaints had dropped significantly. "We're not just changing policies," the chief explained. "We're changing our entire approach to community policing. And it's working." During the lunch break, the Attorney General walked through the station. Officers who once might have avoided eye contact now stopped to share stories, ask questions, or simply say thank you. The walls that had once divided them were slowly coming down. In his old spot by the patrol car window, the officer who'd stopped him now trained others on proper approach techniques. Remember, he told them, every person you stop is someone's family member. They could be a teacher, a doctor, or yes, even the attorney general. But their profession shouldn't matter, their humanity should. Back in the training room, community members shared their experiences, both good and bad. Officers listened, really listened, as people talked about their fears, their hopes, and their desire for mutual understanding. This isn't about making officers feel bad, one community speaker explained. It's about helping them do their jobs better, safer, and fairer for everyone. The Attorney General's phone buzzed. Another department from another state wanting to know more about their training program. Word had spread, and what started as one incident was becoming a model for departments nationwide. At the end of the day, as officers filed out of the training room, many stopped to shake hands with the officer who'd shared his story. His honesty had opened a door that many were now willing to walk through. 6 months ago, I would have seen this as punishment, the officer told the Attorney General as they walked to their cars. Now I see it as an opportunity. We're not just changing procedures, we're changing minds, including my own. The sun was setting as they left the station, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The same lot where, 2 months ago, everything had seemed so different. Now it felt like a place of transformation, where difficult lessons turned into valuable changes. Sometimes, the Attorney General thought as he drove home, the best changes come not from force or fear, but from people willing to learn from their mistakes and teach others to do better. The streetlights were coming on, just like that night, but now they seemed to shine a little brighter. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The state attorney general stood at the podium in the state capitol, presenting the annual law enforcement report. The room was filled with officials, community leaders, and media representatives, all eager to hear the results of the changes implemented across the state. Numbers tell stories, he began, just as he had in that police station conference room a year ago. But today, our numbers tell a story of progress. He clicked to the first slide, showing a graph with a clear downward trend. Unnecessary traffic stops have decreased by 45% across our state. Civilian complaints are down by 60%. But most importantly, he paused, looking up from his notes, public trust in law enforcement has reached its highest level in 15 years. In the front row sat the officer from that night, now a respected trainer who traveled to police departments across the country. He transformed from someone who made questionable stops to someone who taught others how to prevent them. But numbers aren't everything, the Attorney General continued. Real change happens in moments that don't make it into our statistics. He clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of a community gathering. Officers and citizens sharing a meal together, talking, laughing. A hand raised in the audience. How do you respond to critics who say these changes have made police work harder? The Attorney General smiled. I'll let someone else answer that. He gestured to the officer, who stood up confidently. My job isn't harder, the officer said, addressing the crowd. It's clearer. When you remove bias from the equation, you see people for who they really are. That makes our work more effective, not harder. The presentation continued with stories from across the state. A grandmother who no longer worried when her grandchildren borrowed her car. A teenager who wanted to become a police officer after seeing the positive changes in his neighborhood. A veteran officer who said he'd finally remembered why he joined the force in the first place. One traffic stop could have ended with anger and lawsuits, the Attorney General reflected. Instead, it became a catalyst for change that none of us could have predicted. After the presentation, people lingered to share their own stories. A young officer mentioned how the new training had helped her connect better with her community. A civil rights activist talked about the noticeable improvements in police-community relations. The Attorney General's phone buzzed. A message from his son, who was now driving on his own. Just got pulled over for a broken taillight, the message read. Officer was respectful, professional, and helpful. Gave me a warning and directions to the nearest repair shop. Later that evening, walking to his car, he passed the same street where he'd been pulled over a year ago. The memory was still clear, but it felt different now. What could have been just another story of profiling had instead become a story of transformation. In his office, a wall of thank you letters had replaced the old case files. Letters from citizens who'd experienced the change firsthand. Letters from officers who'd found new meaning in their work. Letters from other states asking for guidance in implementing similar programs. As he gathered his things to head home, his assistant brought in one last piece of mail, an invitation to speak at a national law enforcement conference. The topic: turning moments of crisis into opportunities for change. He thought about how one night, one stop, one moment of tension had rippled out to touch so many lives. How sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes, if people were willing to learn and grow. Driving home under the same streetlights that had illuminated that crucial night, he realized that true change wasn't just about new policies or better training. It was about people choosing to see each other differently, choosing to be better, choosing to turn difficult moments into stepping stones toward progress. The story hadn't ended. It had only transformed, becoming part of a larger narrative of positive change that would continue to unfold in communities across the country, one interaction at a time.